I think the difficulty with the Native people is we haven't encouraged them to assume leadership in the church until recently. And you can't go from having no leadership at all to having a whole group of Catholic priests within 5 years or 10 years. We're trying to develop leadership in the Native church. I mean, that's our overall objective. And when I say develop leadership, to develop ownership, that it's their church just as much as it's my church. And that it's not the church of the bishop or the church of the priests or the church of the white people who will come and share the trimmings off the table with them, but it's just as much their church. And therefore, to get them to assume leadership in the church and to help develop this leadership, developing group leaders, both speakers, develop music ministry, develop those who can be missionaries, go around. Some of the people that are here spend their time 1 or 2 days a week visiting around their own reserves or visiting neighboring reserves and talking with the women about the church and about education of their children and talking about values, family values, and at the same time, you know, building up their own prayer communities, the liturgies in their communities, and the social services in their communities. I don't see celibacy or the role of women to be obstacles, major obstacles. Let's face it, celibacy is a challenge to people everywhere, and whether it's in South America or in Africa or in Europe or among the native people here, it's a statement that one of the highest values in life, married life, that there's something more important, and that's the kingdom of God. So I don't see that it's any more difficult for the native people than it is for any other group. With respect to the role of women, I think that in many ways the native community is a maternalistic community. Although ordinarily the men are always the spokespersons, but when you speak of education or speak of health care or speak of values in the community, it's the grandmothers, as I understand, that are responsible for this. And therefore, they have an important role to play. But their tradition, as far as I understand it, is that frequently the man will be the spokesperson for that. And maybe it's a very similar thing that we're finding in the church. So I don't see either of these being an insurmountable obstacle. I think the difficulty with the native people is we haven't encouraged them to assume leadership in the church until recently. And you can't go from having no leadership at all to having a whole group of Catholic priests within 5 years or 10 years. That this is something that must be built up. Well, when I came to Thunder Bay 14 years ago, I knew there were many Indians here, and I knew they made up a significant portion of our population. I suppose at that time it was about 12%. And I didn't know very much about Indian culture and native culture, but shortly after I was ordained bishop and came to Thunder Bay, I visited Brazil, and I visited the missionaries there and saw them in northeastern Brazil, and the work they were doing with the native people there, with the Indian people there. And I thought, well, why aren't we doing similar things in Canada? So I came back to look at what we were doing and to reflect on it and to consult. And the past 14 years has been a growing understanding and appreciation of the culture of the native people. You know, and this has not only been something in northwestern Ontario, but it's been in the church throughout the world. Our current Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, he's talked about culture again and again, both on his visits to various parts of the world, but also in the talks that he's given to the bishops that come from different parts of the world for their visits every 5th year. I remember on one occasion there was, I think it was to the bishops of the Cameroons. He said that the gospel had been preached in the Cameroons for some 50 years, and that all the bishops were native of the Cameroons, and he said the first phase of evangelization had been completed. In other words, all the people had heard about Jesus Christ and had a chance to follow his teachings in his way, to come to know him. Now, he said, the second phase of evangelization begins, which is much more difficult, and that is to integrate the gospel into the culture of the people, or to inform the culture with Christian values. And I realized that we haven't really done a good job on that with respect to the native people here in northwestern Ontario. That we've talked to them about Christianity, that the gospel's been preached here for more than 300 years, but it hasn't been done in the context of really informing their culture. It seemed that sometimes at least people were invited to forget their culture in order to be Christians. And where now it seems to be very important that we bring the culture and the faith together, and that we have the faith, the teachings of Jesus Christ and his life, and that touching and informing and the culture of the Indian people. When you talk of the difference between religion and spirituality, they didn't have a set form of religious doctrines and teachings. They had their medicine man, they had their shamans, they had their ways of doing things, of praying and relating to the Creator, but they didn't have a formalized religion like you would see with the Christians or with the Muslims or the Jews. And so they rather, it was a way of life for them rather than specific things that they did, although they did pray and they did share and they did have a close relationship with God. You see, the test of whether they're Christians in line with the teachings of Christ is whether they promote unity, whether they promote truth, whether they promote justice, whether they promote togetherness, whether they promote forgiveness. And sometimes these are used to stir people up to attack someone else and to go on the warpath, if you will, to put down someone else, to create conflict and disunity. So that's the distinction. These have to be used to promote justice and love and peace and truth. I think one of the difficulties that we're having is that there's a group coming out of the United States, the American Indian Movement, who are trying to almost create a religion out of their culture. But historical research tends to show that they didn't have so much a religion as such, but they had a spirituality. I mean, the native people always pray. The native people always are ready to share. The native people are basically very honest and truthful. And these are virtues which Christianity holds very close to it. I mean, these were very close to the heart of Christ too. So it's not a different thing that when the early Christian missionaries came here, the native people welcomed them because they saw in the teachings of the missionaries the articulation of what they already believed. So they didn't come to tell them something new. They came to tell them the same truths and the same beliefs and about their same relationship with God that they always had, but to put it in a clearer and more definitive context, if you will. So there's not a different God for the Christians and a different God for the Indian, but it's the same God, but it's more explicit in the teachings of Christ. And we believe that Jesus Christ is the fullness of God's revelation, that he came for all people of all time. He didn't just come for the Jews of Palestine of 2,000 years ago. And so it's the responsibilities of the disciples of Christ, the followers of Christ, the church, to bring that gospel, that good news, first to the Greeks, and then to the Romans, and then to the Europeans, and then to the people of every culture. Now, because of the clash between the culture of the Europeans and the native people, in many areas, or many aspects of it, the culture of the native people has been destroyed or made secondary. And now it would seem, my understanding of it is, that we have to assist them in understanding and restoring their cultural aspects and realizing that Jesus Christ came for them just as much as he came for the Romans or the Greeks or the Jews. And so therefore to try to bring the two together rather than replace the culture of the Indian people with the with what they would call the Christian culture, which is really seen as the European culture as it's been mediated in Canada, as it come from the French, or it came from the Irish, or it came from the Germans, or it came from the Ukrainians. Because those are the way Christianity was enculturated, if you will, or brought into the culture of those people. And now in Canada we have this mosaic. But I don't believe we've paid sufficient respect to the culture of the native people and tried to relate the teachings of Christ to the native people. And that's what we're trying to do through these conferences. I don't think it was a question that they couldn't worship in their own ways. I think they were given a different way, and they were told to forget about their culture, to forget about the pipe, to forget about the drum, never to bring the drum into the church, and never to bring the sweetgrass in. You could bring incense from Europe, but you couldn't use sweetgrass. And I think that, you know, there have been faults and failings with the church in the past, and that's why on Thursday night I apologize for all the things that have been done, whether because people thought they were good or bad, but were done in the past to offend or hurt the culture of the people. But I think at the same time, you know, you can't just keep on going back into the past. Pierre Burton, in his books on the Hudson Bay Company, speaks of how the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company would see who could give the most alcohol to the people to get them to fight the other group in that. So this isn't a recent thing, and it's not only been the church, but it's been the whole colonial culture coming in. I would suggest the difference between the white and the native culture is a responsibility on both sides. I think that the white community, the European community of European background, has so marginalized the native people here. I think sometimes it was done with good intentions. I think sometimes it was done just to try and keep them quiet. But you can't take people and put them on welfare at the age of 20 and at the age of 40 expect them to know how to work and how to share their lives with others and how to organize projects and that. If one was to take a son or a daughter at the age of 20 and tell them, you don't have to go to school anymore or go and take anything you want because we don't need you in society, but when you get to be 35, we'll have an important job for you, those people wouldn't be able to do the work at 35 because they don't learn the skills they need to work with others. They don't learn the gift of achievement in their own lives. they don't learn how to organize their lives. Because what we've done is we've said, as long as you stay on your reserves and keep quiet, we'll give you enough money to live on, so our conscience won't bother us, and we can organize Canadian society without you. And to the extent that we try to organize Canadian society without them, we are being unjust towards them. We have a responsibility to encourage them to come and use their gifts and talents. And if some of them are at a stage where they can't use their gifts and talents at this point, we still have a responsibility to see that they get adequate housing and food and things like that. But part of being a human is to have responsible work, to participate, whether it's as a mother, or whether it's as an artist or an architect, or whether it's helping to keep the city clean, or whether it's building houses. But everybody has to have a chance to use their gifts and talents to build up a community. And I believe over the years we've failed the Indian people and been unjust to them in not allowing them to do this. The other aspect of the Oka situation and standing up for rights is that the Native people have been asking the Canadians for rights and to be able to sit down and dialogue with truth and justice and love and reconciliation with respect to these land claims that have never really been settled. And they always do, like they've done over the last 6 years with the Constitution question. Yes, we'll sit down and talk to you, but they don't really seem to echo the sincerity that's needed and the justice that they really want to come to a decision. It seems to be more a delaying tactic. And I mean, we have it even recently that when Elias Harper was speaking to the Manitoba legislature, the Prime Minister said, let's have a Royal Commission to deal with these issues once and for all and get them all cleared up. And now when Meech Lake didn't go through, he's changed his mind and said the Royal Commission is not the way to deal with it. Well, I don't know whether the Royal Commission is the way to deal with it or what is the best way to deal with it, but we have to get a commitment on behalf of the people to sit down and settle these issues and to look at them both globally and individually. You can't put people on a small piece of land, people who traditionally were fishermen and hunters. You drive the animals away, you put in dams, and the fish are all gone, or in one case in northwestern Ontario here from the Reed paper plant, they poisoned the waters. And then you say, well, isn't that too bad? We'll just increase the amount of welfare that you get. But you're marginalizing and emasculating them as a people as a whole. And once you do that with people, you know, the other word that we use in our white society is you spoil them. And that's when they become drunkards, and, you know, they might have the predisposition somewhat, but the circumstance almost forbids them to be responsible people because you don't allow them to be. You take their work away from them, you take their way of life away from them, you take their livelihood away from them, and then you say, well, now, why are you complaining? Didn't we give you enough money last year? The current sensitivity or the heightening awareness of the needs of the Native people, I think that they just can't be silent any longer. And I think that they are a people who tend to get along, to be reconciled. So I think that once this is to the attention of the Canadian people, once our political leaders take serious responsibility for affecting reconciliation, for beginning to settle some of these issues. And it's hard to believe that, you know, 125 years after Confederation, that they haven't really, or they're just beginning to do this. And even following the constitutional agreements of 1982 that, you know, we're 8 years later and nothing's been done, or very little's been done. So it's got to be a high priority on the political scene in Canada. And I think once it's a high priority, and if it's dealt with in truth and justice, and also with a sense of history. I find that many of our white people have no sense of history of our country, where these agreements and treaties came from, how these people gave over their lands under certain conditions, and now these conditions aren't being honored. And I think that if we have a more of a sense of history of what has taken place in the past, then our Canadians as a group will be more open and more understanding of why the Native people continue to ask for justice. Not only do they have things to tell us, but they have an example to give us with respect to family life, with caring for one another. This whole question of ecology, which has come so much to the fore in the last 5 years. The Native people have always been preaching that. Take care of the forests, take care of the water, the lakes and that. You see, here in northwestern Ontario, it's pretty hard to, or difficult to get too concerned about fresh water, and yet fresh water is the scarcest commodity in the whole world. And yet in our area, we probably got 99% of the fresh water in the world. But we still have a special responsibility to care for it. And that's what the natives have been telling us. To care for the fish, to care for the animals, you know, to plant the trees if we're going to cut them down, to use them on the one hand, but on the other hand, to replenish it and realize that the Creator has only put a certain amount of this here for all the people in the world. And that's a lesson that we have to learn, not only as Canadians, but Canadians in relationship both to the Native people who live in the country and the people in the rest of the world. When you realize that the people around the North Atlantic, who make up about 20% of the people in the world, consume 80% of the world's resources, are we trying to say that we're lucky because God gave them to us and let the rest of the people starve? And so we're saying that on the one hand to the people of South America and Africa when we're not sharing with them. And here I'm talking about just economic agreements rather than just handout or aid. And it's the same thing with the Native people. I mean, Canada is a vast country and its population is relatively sparse when you see the size of it. And yet our Native people as a group live in poverty, absolute poverty, because we're trying, as I mentioned earlier, trying to organize Canadian economy without them. And yet family values, justice, truth, sharing, ecology are all values that are very dear to them, and we could learn a lot from them. I see the values that they have are universal values, and they just have them to a deeper sensitivity to them in their culture than we have in our North American culture, which has gone so materialistic. And by materialistic, we judge people and we judge situations by how much money is involved or what kind of a car people drive or what position they have rather than what kind of a person they are. And I think the Indians, with their respect for family life, tend to understand it. Well, who is this person and what do they stand for and who are their family? And so they have a different set of values. And I think the values that they have are much more Christian than many of those that we would see in our Christian churches on the average Sunday. So it's not that they're specifically Indian, but the Indians have embraced them and lived them across the centuries, and therefore from that aspect we have much to learn from them.